Okay, let me go ahead and get things started. We're not starting too late, so that's good. What I wanted to do today is just finish up our logging discussion because we were in the middle of discussing Aries. And remember that Aries is this really sophisticated logging and recovery mechanism that has all kinds of amazing features, and I can't recommend the research paper highly enough because it goes through how all of these things are exposed and offered. But this is a representation of the various details that we've discussed so far. There's a lot beyond this, but at least this captures the basic idea. Every log entry, so we have an example write-ahead log down here for two different transactions that are both in a completed state now, and every record has a log sequence number associated with it, and that just turns out to be the file and the offset in the file, just like we normally do for representing tuple locations and so forth. And we also have this field on every data page that records the log sequence number of the last write to that page. And you can see that it may be different between the page's representation in memory and the page's representation on disk. And we can infer what pages are dirty from that. And you can see that page 1 would not be dirty because it has the page LSNs are matching. So that page has been persisted back to disk since the most recent write. But page 2 has some writes to it, so it is dirty. It still has yet to be written to disk. And so then we also have a dirty page table, which records the set of dirty pages that the database knows about right now. And it has an interesting thing. So it has the same page LSN that we have in the page itself, which just makes it easier to access. But then we also have this additional field, which is the rec LSN, which says this is the log record that corresponds to when this page got dirty. And that'll turn out to be very helpful when we start talking about recovery processing. So Aries has fuzzy checkpoints, and we talked about checkpoints. Checkpoints are just a way of making recovery processing faster. Because remember, if we wanted to do recovery, we don't need checkpoints, but we need to replay the entirety of the log. But checkpoints are a special thing. They're sort of a way of saying, at this point in time, the table files on disk are all in sync with the write-ahead log on disk. And so you don't need to redo any operations before that point. But checkpoints also have a set of incomplete transactions that are recorded with them. We may need to undo things before that point in the log. So checkpoints help us improve the performance of recovery processing. Aries has fuzzy checkpoints, which again is an optimization to help checkpoints be evaluated faster. And so like it says here, Aries checkpoint record includes the things that we already talked about. So a set of all the transactions that are incomplete, but we also keep track of the last LSN for each one of those transactions. So that's just a general thing that we want to keep track of anyway. Like I mentioned in my Moodle email, the 6th assignment will come out before the 5th assignment, and I should be able to release that today. I was up pretty late getting it all ready, and I just want to double check that I didn't accidentally mess something up. So I'll make sure to get that done and then release it today. But every transaction, when we have transactions in flight in the database, we always keep track of the last log sequence number of each transaction so that if we need to roll back the transaction, we know exactly where to go in the log. That's a point, and then we just start going backwards until we've undone all the operations that the transaction was performing. So that's the last LSN value. And but the Aries checkpoint also includes this dirty page table. And the dirty page table will say, these are all the pages that are currently dirty that haven't been written out to disk yet. And the page LSN and rec LSN values are also included in this checkpoint. And the fuzzy checkpoint procedure is basically like what we discussed before. You write and flush all the in-memory log records to disk. So you play out or you write out the write-ahead log all the way up to the checkpoint record. Make sure that that all gets synced to disk so you know it's on the platter. And then you write and flush the checkpoint record. And since it's a fuzzy checkpoint, we don't actually write out the set of dirty pages yet. We take care of that afterward. And this is one of those nice things that's really neat, is that because of this, we're able to improve the performance of our logging and our checkpointing in Aries. So the buffer manager will have some kind of background operation where it's basically hunting for dirty pages and writing them out. And obviously, as it does this, it needs to make sure that it follows the write-ahead logging rule. Remember, the write-ahead logging rule is that all of my changes in table files have to be reflected in the write-ahead log on disk before I write those pages out to disk. So it just makes sure to do that. And it can schedule these writes in any order that it wants, so it can try to optimize the order that it writes things out. So like it says here, a dirty page is flushed to disk. We can look at the page LSNs to figure out, okay, what is the latest log record that corresponds to this page's contents? So in this case, if since page 1 is not dirty, I don't care about it, but page 2 is dirty, and so I can go and look and say, well, page LSN reflects the latest change, or the log record corresponding to the latest change I've made. So if I want to write page 2, I just have to make sure that I write out the write-ahead log at least to LSN 362. I have to make sure that I at least include that record when I'm writing them all out to disk. Okay? So it's very easy to do that because we have these page LSN values. Any questions? This is one of the things you'll have to implement for NanoDB, because what you'll notice is in database systems, we try to make it as simple as possible. We ask for pages, we look at the contents of pages, but the file manager and the buffer manager play together to make sure that we do that in an optimal way. So we try to load pages as infrequently as possible, and we never quite say, I want to write this out to disk. That's the buffer manager and the transaction manager's job. So when the buffer manager needs more space, it says, okay, I need to evict some pages, and that's when the pages get written to disk, and the transaction manager takes care of the write-ahead logging rule and so forth. But beyond that, the transactions or the operations against the databases don't really care about what's going on at that level. They never actually ask anything to be written back. So recovery processing, let's look at how this is used. We have 3 phases in Aries, and the first phase is an analysis phase, where it basically does what we had before. Because when we described our recovery processing before, the redo phase actually incorporated both analysis and recovery. I mean, analysis and replaying history. So it's one phase of recovery. So in this case, though, we separate it out because we have to do a couple of things. The first thing is we have to figure out where we want to start. We have to figure out what set of pages are dirty. So that's basically what we're saying here. The set of data pages that must be brought into sync with the write-ahead log state. And the set of incomplete transactions that have to be rolled back. And I think it's funny, just as a footnote, that the Aries paper calls them loser transactions, because they lose out. But anyway, that's what it calls transactions that are incomplete at the time that the system was shut down, whether it was intentional or not. Okay? So the analysis phase, basically we go to the latest checkpoint record, and that checkpoint record has 2 things that we need. It has the set of incomplete transactions, and remember that it also has the last LSN for each one of those transactions. And we also have a copy of the dirty page table at the point of that checkpoint. So, and the dirty page table will have these rec LSNs that we can look at. So basically the rec LSN being, this is the point where the page became dirty. And like I say here, we can use that set of rec LSNs to figure out where we need to start redoing from. So we have this redo LSN value, and that's the log sequence number where we need to start replaying from to repeat history. So let's say that this is the dirty page table that's in our checkpoint record. We have page IDs. These are the dirty pages. Maybe they're just page numbers. Obviously, we need to include the file name as well, the file name and page number in the dirty page table. And we have the page LSN, or the latest record that was applied to the page. And then we also have rec LSN, which is the earliest record that was applied to the page. So what would be the redo LSN? Where do we need to start replaying from, given this dirty page table? Remember that at the point of checkpoint, the dirty pages have not been written to disk yet. So where do we need to start replaying from? 345. So we're looking at the smallest rec LSN value, right, that we see in our dirty page table. Very good. So yeah, basically the rule is we need to go and find out what point in the log sort of starts the series of operations that were performed against pages. And so we just go through the dirty page table. The dirty page table makes it very easy to do that. Okay? Now we're going to revisit this idea in a moment, so keep thinking about redo LSN, but already we figured out this is where we need to start replaying from for the redo phase. Now we go ahead and look at the set of dirty pages. Yeah, so we, what am I saying? Oh yeah, so of course we have the initial, I lost my train of thought. So we have the set of initial transactions, and of course that may not be the set of transactions we need to roll back, because some of those transactions may have been completed after the checkpoint. Some point after the checkpoint we have a commit, or we have an abort for a transaction that appeared in the checkpoint record. Or we may have pages in the dirty page table, I should say pages that get added to the dirty page table afterward that we need to go ahead and incorporate into our most accurate dirty page table. So we start scanning forward through the write-ahead log. And interestingly, we start with the checkpoint record, not the redo LSN value. Because remember, we're still in the analysis phase. The checkpoint record says this is the set of incomplete transactions at the checkpoint. This is the dirty page table at this checkpoint. So now what we do is we continue forward to make sure we get what is the most accurate set of transactions that are incomplete and the dirty page table that is accurate as well at the end of the log, not just at the checkpoint. So we scan forward. If we see a begin, we add it to the set of incomplete transactions. That's very easy. Obviously, the last LSN is just going to be TI begins LSN, because that's where we start undoing. If we see other things, so commit or abort, now the transaction is completed. We know that it's been saved, and it's in the write-ahead log, so we can go ahead and continue on. We remove it from the set of incomplete transactions because it is completed. And if we see update records or redo-only update records, then we go ahead and update the transaction's last LSN. Because again, if we have to roll back this TI, that's where to start. So we are always updating the last LSN to keep track of where this transaction's last operation actually is recorded in the log. That way we can roll it back. Also, notice we have XJ appear in these update operations, and these are writes. Obviously, we do not record reads in the write-ahead log. There's no point in recording reads in the write-ahead log, so we know that XJ is changed, and if XJ doesn't appear in the dirty page table yet, we need to go ahead and add it. And so we add XJ to the dirty page table, and the LSN, the rec LSN for that page, is the LSN of this update record. Okay? So these are the things that we have to do. Now you could imagine if you had subsequent updates to these things, and you could update the page LSN for that table, but the rec LSN is set by the first time we see XJ. So we just continue this process forward, and by the end of it, we will have the actual set of incomplete transactions that need to be rolled back, and we also will have the proper state of the dirty page table. So now the analysis phase is complete, and we can begin redoing stuff, replaying history, and we can also then take care of unrolling any transactions that were incomplete. Okay? So we have an up-to-date dirty page table. And yeah, like we talked about this last time, that Aries has a reason why it keeps a page LSN on every table page or every data page, because it may be an index page or something that keeps track of schema or something like that. But since we have this page LSN value in each page, we always know the last operation that was applied to that page. And so when we are redoing things, we may come across a log record with an LSN value that's earlier than the page LSN of the page that it applies to. And if we have that situation where the record is earlier than the current state of the page, we just don't apply it again. There's no reason to, because the page already reflects the state of that record. And like I say, this is necessary for the idempotence of the Aries logging mechanism, because we do have some things that should be applied only once, and so we need to make sure that those things are applied only once, and this page LSN value allows us to do that. The other reason why is because why do something twice if we don't have to? So we can use page LSN to be more efficient as well, even if we have situations that things can be applied multiple times. So we repeat history. We just go through, and we can just do this in one straight rush through the log, straightforward. And like I say here, if XJ's page is in the dirty page table, and there's also another condition which I don't have explicitly enumerated here. So XJ's page is in the dirty page table, and also its page LSN is lower than the record's LSN that we're applying. Then we go ahead and apply the update, and if one of those conditions doesn't hold, then we know that we don't need to actually update that page anymore. It was written out, or some other situation occurred and we don't need to actually take care of it. Actually, it would be highly unusual, I think, for the record to refer to something that's, well, yeah, no, it would be highly unlikely because we would have already gone through the analysis phase. This would have added XJ to the dirty page table. So this may need to be refined a little bit. Okay, anyway, just moving on. Yeah, so we finished redoing, and now all the pages in memory match the write-ahead log. And we can write them out, and so forth. But because we have this dirty page table, and because we have these page LSN values, we can make this redo phase as fast as possible. And of course, now we need to go ahead and undo incomplete transactions. So this is the undo phase, so now we start rolling things back. And what's interesting about this is, of course, we have the set of incomplete transactions, and we know the LSN, the last LSN for each transaction. Where is the point in the record that is the last operation for this transaction? And what's interesting about this is we could do all of them in a batch, just like I described before. We could just go backward through the data file, undoing things in one big shot, just like I described before. Or we could do them individually. And so this is where we can actually parallelize the undo processing. We could start 10 threads, and each one of those 10 threads could take a tenth of the transactions that need to be rolled back. Now, presumably you would have a lot of transactions if you warranted starting 10 threads. But you can actually parallelize this step because each transaction record knows where the next thing, or I should say the previous thing in the transaction is in the log, and so it's easy to actually parallelize this and have different threads handle different transaction rollbacks. And of course, as this goes on, we have to write compensation log records as well, and those will have an LSN, it'll update the page LSN and so forth. And so even if we had a crash during the undo phase, let's say that some of the data makes it out, it turns out that Aries does issue checkpoints along the way during recovery processing so that you can sort of keep moving forward. And that way, if you crash during recovery, you could just resume from that checkpoint instead of the original checkpoint you were trying from. But you can see that compensation log records will update page LSNs, and so each CLR will only be applied once to a page and so forth. So there's a lot of cleverness in how this is all done. Yeah, so this is what I was describing before. When you have this many writes and stuff, checkpoints are to save you time in recovery processing. That's the whole reason why they exist. They don't, if your database never crashed, you don't need checkpoints. If you had an awesome, perfect database running on awesome, perfect hardware, you would never have to worry about checkpoints because at the end, your database would shut down cleanly and all the pages that were still in memory would be written out, and they'd be written out after the corresponding write-ahead log entries were written out. Everything would be perfect and fine and happy. But checkpoints are to help improve recovery processing. And if you do have a large database that's handling a ton of transactions, and you've got a giant log that you need to replay and your recovery processing is taking time, well then you can checkpoint periodically, and so that if you do crash, you can just go back to that point and resume the next time you have to do recovery. Okay? And of course at the very end you can always issue a checkpoint that will have no incomplete transactions and no dirty pages, and that's a great place to pick up too. If your database were to crash immediately after recovery. Okay, any questions on this? So that just basically illustrates this whole notion of Aries. Very neat stuff. Like I said, it is used all over the place. And so having a sense of how it works is really helpful if you happen to be getting into lower level database system stuff or file system stuff. If you want to understand file system journaling, it's very helpful to understand Aries. It's a general concept. It's not something that has to be tied only to databases. And it's also helpful because NanoDB has a very, very simplified version of what we've talked about, which is already a very simplified version of Aries. So, once you see these things, it'll be much clearer why certain things exist in NanoDB. Okay, so any question about this? Because that actually turns out to be all we're going to discuss about transaction durability and atomicity at this point. Okay? It actually is sufficient to implement transaction durability and atomicity, as you will see when you get assignment 6. So transaction isolation is the next thing we're going to talk about. Remember, what are the acid properties? It's a great thing to sort of drill yourself on, make sure that you understand what the set is. So atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. So we have these 4 properties. We've talked about atomicity and durability. We don't really talk about consistency because that's just up to the database to enforce, and if it ever sees an invalid state change, it just says, stop it, transaction is aborted, sorry everybody, but we've got to roll this back because we have a consistency violation. And you'll see how we can do this actually in the indexing lab, which I'm hoping to actually get to this week. And you'll see that you can have a component in your database that verifies consistency as the database performs various operations. And when you have transactions, it becomes super simple to just say, all right, everybody stop, we're going to abort this, and then the transaction processing mechanisms will allow you to roll those things back very easily. So pretty neat. But we need to start talking about isolation. So isolation is, now we're in the realm of concurrent access. And this is where it becomes very important to make sure that transactions don't step on each other. And some of this material we already saw in 121, so I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. But remember, we had 5 different kinds of spurious results that could occur, and one we're going to talk about today if we get to it. But if we don't impose proper isolation, then we can start running into these spurious results. So we had dirty writes, transaction writes a value to X, another transaction writes a value to X and commits, or it aborts. And so the problem is we lost T1's value that it wrote. So we clobbered another write, and now we don't have an easy way of rolling, but like, what do we roll back to? Okay. Dirty read. So a transaction writes a value to X, T2 reads X, so it now gets T1's dirty value. And then if T1 aborts, T2 is stuck. And it becomes even worse if we allowed T2 to commit before T1 had decided whether it wanted to commit or abort, then we're really in trouble. Because we just committed and said something is valid, but the value it read was actually from another transaction. So that is horrible, and we need to prevent that. Non-repeatable read. So T1 reads X, T2 writes X or deletes X and then commits, and then T1 sees that X has changed. Now, hopefully already you can start to see that the problem here is a scheduling problem. What do we allow to occur, and when do we allow it? Because if we see, for example, that for dirty reads, T1 writes a value to X, and then T2 wants to read X. The problem is we're allowing it to do it right away. We're not delaying T2's read of X. We could be clever and say, oh, T1 wrote to X. T2, you are not allowed to read X until we know what T1 is doing. We could do that. So you can see that a lot of this stuff is scheduling. Same thing with non-repeatable reads. T1 reads X, T2 writes X. Well, if we were clever, we'd say, oh, but T1 read X already, so T2, you are not allowed to do anything until T1 decides what its deal is, what it's going to do. So it all fundamentally comes down to scheduling these operations. When do we allow these operations to occur? The phantom rows is kind of a non-repeatable read at a row level. This one took a little while to discover, but you have T1 reads rows that satisfy some predicate. T2 writes rows or deletes rows, some of which also satisfy that predicate. Notice T1 hasn't finished yet. And so if T1 repeats its read, well, it's non-repeatable. It gets a different set of values. So you can imagine if T1 was computing an aggregate based on some predicate. and then some other transaction was changing the set of rows that T1 was looking at, then T1 could now write values that are out of date with respect to what other transactions are doing. Okay, lost update. So T1 reads the value of x, T2 writes a value of x, and T1 writes to x based on this previously read value. T2's write is the one that is lost. Because T1 read, let's say it's like adding $50 to your bank account balance. So T1 reads a balance and then adds 50 to it. T2 goes and does something else to that same balance, and then T1 writes it, and T2's change was lost. Okay? Any questions about these phenomena? These are not the entire set. We start getting into some really fascinating ones that sort of inform how we would like our transaction processing system to work. But this is the most important set, yes. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about transaction execution schedules. We're going to talk about it today too, if we get to it. But the whole idea is, how do we allow these operations to interleave? And so again, that's where it comes down to scheduling. If we say, well, a particular interleaving is invalid, then we can delay somebody, and that, thereby avoid the spurious phenomenon. There's other options as well, and we're actually going to cover a couple of different approaches. There's some really interesting approaches that have been applied to this problem. So we'll be going through that. Okay, so yeah, simple solution, and again, we talked about this a while ago, is to just enforce that everybody has to be run in sequence. So we never allow two transactions to overlap at all. And when we do that, we say that it is serial execution, because everybody gets to have the database to itself while its transaction is running. Now, of course, we talked about this before. This is terribly slow because many times transactions do not involve resources that are actually overlapping. So it's only if we have things operating on the same resources or the same data values that we need to be careful about isolation. Like it says here, for every pair of transactions, Ti and Tj, and we wrote it this way on purpose, it appears that either one ran and then the other ran, or the other ran and then the first one ran. Okay? So that is basically what isolation imposes. So if we can interleave these operations, and we can do things much more quickly, I think I talked about this before, because think about all the other things that the database has to do. Now we have write-ahead logging that databases have to do. You have values being processed, values being looked up. All of these things have to occur. So if we're allowed to interleave these operations, we can get much higher throughput on our database transaction processing. So our goal is to execute things in a way that looks isolated. Okay? And like I say here, the way that we define it looks isolated is that we want to execute according to some schedule. Like if you were to look at all the operations that all transactions ever perform, that is an execution schedule involving multiple transactions. And we want it to be equivalent to a serial execution schedule. So now we have a new question. Well, what does it mean for a schedule to be equivalent to a serial execution schedule? But we have a name for it, and it's called serializable. And you'll see why when we start talking about how we tell if something is serializable. But what we're saying is, if something is serializable, it is interleaved, or it may be interleaved, but it is also equivalent to a serial execution schedule. And there's a whole bunch of different kinds of execution schedules. Serializable is the lower bound of what we must have for correctness. But then there's a lot of other characteristics we would prefer to have because they're more efficient or they're easier to reason about. And so we actually do something that's much stricter than just serializable. But this is the place where we have to start. So we'll look at all of this in some detail. Okay, yeah, so we talked about this in 121, so I'm going to spend a little bit of... I think I'm going to skip over most of this. So we have the various isolation levels, and there are other forms of isolation. We call them weak isolation because they're really not isolation. We allow some side effects to be visible between transactions, and they do increase throughput because we don't have to delay people as often, but they also allow some of these spurious phenomena to occur. So we had the 4 isolation levels, and there's a 5th one now. Serializable is the one that I described before, and that's strong isolation because it's like real isolation. It's like isolation for reals. We make sure that transactions actually look like they're not executing in overlapping ways where they can see each other's side effects. And this is the only isolation level that satisfies the original definition. So serializable is like the holy grail, but almost nobody tries to achieve it because it's just a little bit too slow. Even serializable is a little bit too slow. Okay, so then we have weak isolation levels. We have repeatable reads. Remember, this allows the, what does this allow? Let me see, yeah. So transaction, multiple reads of X produce same results regardless of committed writes in X to other transactions. So we'll look at what spurious phenomena. I think this allows phantoms, but I'd have to go back and look. Read committed. So if I'm executing in a transaction and other transactions are writing to the value I'm looking at, I see their committed changes. I never see uncommitted changes, but I always see committed changes. So you can see that this obviously suffers from the non-repeatable read phenomenon, or spurious phenomenon. So I'm reading a value and I see it change as my transaction continues to execute. And then you have read uncommitted, which is like everything. Okay? I can read values that haven't been committed, so now if I do something based on that value and then commit, who knows what guarantees I can actually provide now in my database. And the 5th one that I wanted to mention, we'll talk about it specifically in the future. There's another one called snapshot isolation, which is really close to serializable isolation, but it's also relatively efficient to enforce. And so even though you may not get to serializable isolation, you can oftentimes achieve snapshot isolation and be very, very efficient. So we'll talk about that one in a couple of lectures. Okay, so these are the various phenomena that are allowed by the various isolation levels. So serializable prevents everything. Repeatable reads, yes, so it allows phantoms. Read committed allows non-repeatable reads, which we talked about, and read uncommitted allows dirty reads. And I don't know why it would prevent dirty writes. I'd have to go look at that, but maybe that's just by the SQL standard. The read uncommitted isolation level is not supposed to allow dirty writes. So you'd have to look into that. Okay, let's see. So we can set the transaction isolation level, not in NanoDB, and just keep in mind, of course, that not every database supports all 4 of these. MySQL InnoDB is unusual in that it actually supports all 4. So it's a great database to experiment with the various isolation levels if you're curious what they do. Postgres, for example, only does serializable, which is snapshot actually, and read committed. Those are the 2 isolation levels that Postgres supports. And I think Oracle is the same way. So you'd have to look at what databases support what isolation levels. Okay, quickly before we go on, does anybody have any questions about this stuff, isolation levels? This is really only informational because, like I said, NanoDB can't even do concurrent access right now, but it is helpful to know about. We basically will only talk about achieving serializable execution schedules because that's sort of the most important thing. All the rest of this is just relaxation of the rules that we follow. Okay? So, yeah, we can model transactions as series of reads and writes, and we talked about this a little bit before. This is a serial execution schedule. The transactions do not overlap. And the important thing about a schedule is that it is, how should I say it? You can think of it as being a single thread of execution. You are not allowed to do multiple operations at once. So really, when you come down to it, in the database, there may be a lot of things that can be concurrent, and a great database will have a lot of concurrent things, but when it comes down to file system reads and writes, those things that you do, those things are always done one at a time. So that's sort of where the rubber meets the road. This is where you have to get into what things, I shouldn't say file system reads and writes, because it really is like, I want to read and write a data page, so it could be the buffer manager helps impose this, the file system, or the file manager helps impose this. It really is the transaction manager is governing reads and writes to pages. So these things, you can never have like a write B and a read A overlapping. At some fundamental level in the database, there will be a constraint that you can't do that. Okay, so a serial schedule never allows the reads and writes of two transactions to be interleaved. Like I said, TI has all of its stuff, and then TJ has all of its stuff. You don't have any overlap at all. And it's nice because it does avoid all spurious results, but it's not very efficient. So we can interleave things. And I think we actually presented this example before. Is this equivalent to a serial execution schedule? Does this also avoid all of the spurious phenomena we described? And the answer is yes, because they only have one common value, A, and because they are interleaved in the way that they are, A gets updated properly. It looks like TI executes before TJ. And we have the benefit that both of them commit, so we're happy. If TI aborted, then we'd have a problem. And we talked about this briefly, but we'll develop this a little bit more as we go through these things. So yeah, we need to make sure the results are valid. So we need to make sure this schedule is serializable. So what makes it serializable? And we already started talking about this briefly when I mentioned this at the beginning of transaction processing. We have some intuitive sense that reads and writes to the same data value are important to think about. And we have a read, modify, write in TI of A. And we have a read, modify, write of A in TJ. And we need to think about how those things are interleaved. Reads and writes of B and C we don't care about because they don't actually work on the same data item. So we have schedule containing operations performed by two different transactions. And we have an instruction I from transaction TI and an instruction J from transaction TJ. And they're adjacent to each other. So it's I comes before J or I comes after J. So the question is, when can we actually swap these two instructions that are adjacent to each other? And really the question is, when will swapping the order of these instructions affect the overall outcome of the database execution? Sure, yeah. So if they don't operate on the same data item, we can definitely swap them. That's okay. What if they do affect the same item?
It's a simple as add 50 add 30. Whether it's swap it. Let's say add 30 add 50.
That is a very interesting observation. Yeah, but remember that our log, like, we don't care about the add parts. There's a really excellent book about transaction processing. It's not the Jim Gray book, which I've already mentioned, called Transaction Processing. It's very difficult to find. Just get on Amazon and you can have it ordered right away. But there's another book called Concurrency, Control, and Recovery in Database Systems. It is an awesome book. And it's one of those books that's like a half-inch thick. It's like a very sort of demure-looking little book. And that thing is so badass because it covers basically all of the transaction processing theory you really ever need to know for database systems. I think one of the authors' names is Goodstein. But the guy is a researcher at Microsoft Research. And the book was published years ago. And now the entire text is available online as a PDF. So get it. It's really good. But anyway, it goes through all these kinds of things. If our write-ahead log included things like add 50 to A and add 50 to B, if we had, or add 30 to B, if we had primitives that were like this, where we could actually say, this is how I'm changing my value, then you can start having operations that don't conflict in very interesting ways. And so it allows you to reorder transactions in ways that we can't right now, because our primitives are, I want to read this page and I want to write this page, or I want to read this item and write this item. So what you bring up as far as like, well, what if we had a primitive, or you can see it in our schedule. We're modifying A, we're modifying B in specific ways. If we recorded operations at that level in our schedules, we could actually reorder a lot more than we do. But right now, we really can only do the reads and the writes and the commits and the starts and the aborts. So in that case, what are we left with? Can you switch to reads? Yeah, so if at least one of them is a write, we're stuck. And what we say is we can't flip them because they conflict with each other. Okay? But like I say here, if we can't swap the instructions I and J without affecting the results, we say that the operations conflict, And so, let's say your instruction I is read A or write A on a datum item A, and then J is read or write on a different data item B, then we don't care, because flipping the operations will not affect the overall result. Doesn't matter what order we execute. We already talked about this. If they're different data items, they don't conflict. We can flip them. Now, if we have them involving the same data item, then we have to think a little bit more carefully. If they're both reads, we can execute them in any order. It will not affect the results. If one is a read and one is a write, we can't. And obviously, if one's a write and one's a read, then we can't. And then also, if we have two writes, can we swap them? Well, all you really need to think about is, well, I have these two writes to the same thing, and the final value of Q is affected by what order I do these things. So the next read is what actually suffers, if you think about it. Because the next read is what actually observes what order the writes went in. So that's why we need to be very careful in reordering writes. Okay? So, this gives us a way of reasoning about execution schedules. And you can see that we're talking about two instructions that are adjacent conflicting with each other or not conflicting with each other, which is why we call this conflict equivalence, because we say that things conflict. So, two instructions conflict if they operate on the same data item and at least one of the operations is a write. And if they do not conflict, then we can flip their order and we have an equivalent schedule. But we don't just have an equivalent schedule, because there's actually other definitions of equivalence, which we may actually end up talking about. I hope we do, because I have to add a little bit of detail to one of my slide decks in the future. But this is called conflict equivalence. They are equivalent because they only flip non-conflicting instructions. So let's say that we have these two execution schedules, S and S prime. And if we can take S, and through a series of swapping non-conflicting adjacent instructions, we can change it into S prime, then they are conflict equivalent. Okay? So that's our definition of conflict equivalence. And so, like I say here, a schedule is conflict serializable if it is conflict equivalent to a serial schedule. So you can see that you could have two conflict equivalent schedules that are not serializable. if you were dumb, okay, you could certainly have that situation. So we say that it's conflict serializable to say, well, it's not just conflict equivalent to some other schedule, it's conflict equivalent to a serial execution schedule. And so if we look at these, are these schedules conflict equivalent? Well, can we swap non-conflicting instructions that are adjacent to each other to end up with one or the other? And if you look at it, you can say read A becomes A minus 30, write A, and that doesn't conflict with anything else that follows it. So we could swap the read, modify, write, commit of B with the read, modify, write of A. We can flip those, and now we end up with the left schedule. Right? Everybody see that? So they're conflict equivalent. We can swap only non-conflicting operations to get to the other schedule. So the question is the right schedule conflict serializable? And that should be really obvious, right? Because the left schedule is a serial execution schedule. So the right one is, by definition, conflict serializable. Because we have just shown that it is conflict equivalent to a serial schedule. All right, questions? Thankfully, this is pretty straightforward. Now here's another one. Is the right schedule conflict serializable? Yes or no? You have a 50% chance of getting it right. Flip a coin. Yes, because we can swap non-conflicting instructions to get it to the serial execution schedule. Right? We can move the read, modify, write of B in TI all up so that it all appears before TJ. Right? So that seems fine. Do you guys like this schedule or not? Do you see any potential issues? Yeah.
So like all of that stuff, reading C and writing C doesn't need to be executed together with
Well, it doesn't need to. But I'm talking about more basic concerns. Like, let's say that these transactions don't necessarily commit. Maybe they abort instead. Remember, we talked about this already. We already had an example of this where, let's say the TI aborts instead of committing. Then we start running into some challenges. Because if TI aborts, TJ has read a value from TI that is now invalid. So what if we have this execution schedule? So the problem is if TI aborts, but TJ has already committed, then we have now violated either atomicity or durability. Because TJ has seen a portion of what TI has done. And like I say, we could preserve atomicity by aborting TJ when TI aborts, but we already said it committed, so we're not allowed to do that. It's supposed to be durable. We committed it, and it stays committed. So we can't really preserve both atomicity and durability here. So this is really gross. But it's conflict serializable. I thought that was fine. Well, it's not. We have some additional constraints. Okay? So what this kind of schedule is called is a non-recoverable execution schedule. Because it's not possible to recover from certain execution schedules. In this case, it is not possible to recover from this series of operations. We can't preserve our acid properties. Now, what can we do? Remember, you can think of this as being a basic scheduling problem. So TI reads, modifies, writes, and then TJ comes in and wants to read. So what could we do to take this non-recoverable schedule and turn it into a recoverable schedule? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Yeah. Do the reads at the same time. That will possibly, we can't switch the read and the write of A, like between TI and TJ. So what do you mean do the reads at the same time? Okay, because remember, we're not allowed to do multiple things at once. So what's something we could do to make this okay? Yeah. I'm sorry? Could you commit? Well, you can't, because then the read and write of A and B won't be part of the same transaction. Just think about scheduling. Don't change the schedule except by delaying things or reordering things or moving things. It still has to be conflict equivalent or conflict serializable. What if we just delayed TJ's read until we find out what TI wants to do? Or maybe we could just delay TJ's write. Or maybe we could just delay TJ's commit. Like we could move the commit down past TI's abort. And so basically, when TJ says, I want to commit, then we say, well, that's fine and good, except you read a value from TI, and so we have to wait to see what TI does before we can allow your commit to occur. So it would enter the partially committed state and stay there. And if TI finally said, you know what, I'm aborting, then the database would turn around and say, sorry, TJ, you read a value that was from TI, so we've got to abort you as well. So like I say here, you want to constrain yourself to only recoverable schedules. And so moving the commit is the smallest thing that you could do, as opposed to moving the reads or moving the writes. So we could delay those things as well. But in this case, we're just going to delay the commit. And like I say here, if TJ reads a data item previously written by TI, TJ is not allowed to commit until TI completes. Okay? And obviously, if it commits, we can go on. If it aborts, we have to abort TJ as well. All right, questions? So that's recoverable versus non-recoverable. And you'll notice that serializable execution schedules still have these other negative characteristics. Yeah. Okay, let's see what time it is. Yeah, so like I say here, we can make it recoverable by delaying TJ's commit operation. So we go ahead and do that. So like I was saying, it enters a partially committed state because it says it wants to commit, but we aren't going to allow it to commit until TI finishes. And then when it does, then we can go ahead and abort TJ. All right? So yeah, like I say here, TJ is dependent on TI because TJ has read something that TI wrote. And so this is the general rule for recoverable execution schedules. If I have a dependent transaction, meaning the transaction read a value that another transaction wrote. I am not allowed to commit that dependent transaction until the transaction that it is dependent on has actually committed. And if the transaction that I'm dependent on aborts, then I have to abort as well. Okay, questions? We will go ahead and resume this next time because it's time to quit. But we'll go ahead and continue talking about these various kinds of execution schedules on Monday, and we'll go ahead and start fleshing out this whole notion of isolation. All right, so have a good weekend.